Thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. I'm so excited to be here to present this recital for you for the opening of this concert series. I think many months ago, at least maybe 6 or 8 months ago, when I first submitted the program for this afternoon's concert to the artistic committee of the here, I wanted to bring a variety of music that actually reflects the cultural heritage that we cherish for the piano literature. And we have some music actually from many different centuries, from the Baroque period to the 20th century, and it also includes some of the great music, as you will hear in the second half, from both Canada and the United States. So because I grew up in Canada since when I was a child, and I wanted to bring some music here for the first time, some Canadian music that everybody will might find interesting. And also because I studied mostly in the United States for my schools, so I present some of the great American music here as well. So we'll begin this recital. There's a fly around. We'll begin this recital with some music by Johann Sebastian Bach, and which is from the Baroque period. Since the 1950s and 1960s, concert pianist starts to play works by Bach on the modern piano, because before that time it was mostly played on the harpsichord. And the reason that a lot of pianists started to play it on the modern piano is because we feel that the modern piano can produce a lot more different kinds of sonorities that the original instrument doesn't produce. Not to take away any credentials from harpsichordists, because Bach lived in a time that there were no pianofortes available. So he wrote for a entirely different instrument. But since the 1960s, I would say mostly in the 1960s, or even earlier, maybe as early as 1950s, people started to play the major keyboard works by Bach on the pianoforte. So we're going to hear the first Partita by Bach. The Partita is a 6-movement suite. That's a group of dances that reflects the cultural entertainment of its day, because there were no other cultural events during his time. But what's interesting is actually, I was reading about the history of the partitas. The sad movement, which is called the saraband, which is one of the partitas, originated from, I believe, Spanish-speaking countries. So you could imagine that maybe we are playing the guitar on the piano, or some kind of these early Baroque instruments that reflects the loneliness, that character in this. It's great that Bach was able to incorporate that into this partita, as well as other composers of his time. So, and also I feel the music is actually very virtuosic, even though it was written just for him, for a group of his friends, or you play it in your living room. Back then, that was just basically it. You don't play it in a concert hall. So it's actually very virtuosic, I would say, the Bach partitas. And you will hear the first one, which is actually probably one of the most well-known of his partitas. So, thank you. So we're going to move on to another German composer, the second of the Bs. It's it's the Hunt Sonata by Beethoven. I actually don't really know why it's called the Hunt, because Beethoven normally doesn't give titles to his own music. It's probably later added on by others, by other publishers or people in other, in later centuries or decades after when it's published. This sonata is actually very interesting because that normally we associate Beethoven as somebody as actually more tempered person, like more heroic, but also very angered person. But this sonata actually to me oftentimes is actually more humorous, and it actually tells us that the classical music, it doesn't have to be so serious all the time. So actually actually shows some other sides of the composer, because actually I believe Beethoven was actually a very in some ways, he had a very witty character in him that actually he portrays in many of his compositions. So this is one of them. And also, to me, there's a lot of the singing qualities, like to make the piano as if it's a singing instrument, especially in the lyrical movement of this sonata. So, and also, I was reading something about Beethoven, because before his deafness, before he couldn't hear anymore, he still gave concerts, some concerts, not a lot. He gave some concerts throughout his life, and he always played in a more free way, a more according to people. That's because we have no recordings of him playing. So according to people, that he always played in a more freely manner, and there's a sense of improvisation in his playing, which is actually not very associated with the Beethoven that we know, because we often think of Beethoven as a more serious composer, and he's always very, very punctual to the rhythm. So this is I guess, the Opus 31, number 3, in E flat major. He wrote actually many works in E flat major. I don't know why he loves this key so much, because he did write, the Emperor Piano Concerto, also in the E flat major. He and several of his trios were also in E flat major. Of course, the Eroica Symphony as well. So there you have it, the Hunt Sonata.
Thank you.
So we're gonna take a detour to change the idiom actually a bit here. The next composer is Alexander Scriabin, and some of you might not be familiar with this composer because that he's actually mostly known for his piano music because he wrote very little symphonic music, but he wrote a lot of piano music, and he was a very active composer, actually a very, very influential composer during the turn of the century. And he was actually a classmate of Sergei Rachmaninoff at the Moscow Conservatory. And most of you probably don't know that even I didn't know about this until a few years ago, that Alexander Scriabin actually made a tour in the United States. I think sometime during the early part of the 20th century that he came here and did a recital tour in a few cities, like in Chicago and in some other eastern state cities. And he actually got into an argument with the mayor of Chicago for some, I think, visa issues. I don't know what exactly it was, but I still have to find out because I read some article about this. He was a very, very fascinating composer that he was born and raised in Russia, but his music doesn't sound Russian at all. So it's actually his own kind of idiom that he incorporated from various romantic composers, and also himself, because he actually created his own harmonic languages, romantic harmonic language, and he actually sees music as a manifestation of the human spirit, like the purification of the soul. So he has his own ideologies that actually, because he was lucky, because had he lived until the revolution, his ideology would be just no for that, you know. But he died actually a few years before the revolution, and actually Rachmaninoff actually played a benefit recital in Moscow of a full recital of his music actually. So he was actually a very influential composer that at the beginning of the 20th century, and actually influenced a lot of the Western European composers. So this piece I'm going to play is called the Fantasie in B minor by Alexander Scriabin, which is this has a reputation as one of his late romantic works because he had a transitional period into a more impressionistic writing throughout his middle period. So this is actually a bridge between his romantic period to the middle period. So it's very contrapunctually dense and also very complicated harmonies. And also, it's not very long, it's actually only about 7 or 8 minutes, but it actually has a reputation as one of the most difficult pieces for the piano to play. And he was actually a very small man that when people describe him, and he's always very nervous. So he was actually supposed to give a recital I think in Kiev, in Ukraine, because he traveled to Kiev to give a recital. And the pianist, I think it was Horowitz, he was a boy back then. And Horowitz was a boy. He was he was a Jewish American pianist who came into this country, Vladimir Horowitz. Some of you might know. And he met him, and he said Scriabin was always very nervous, and he was about to premiere a lot of his works, which makes him very anxious. So, a very fascinating composer that I believe that should be heard in our century, and actually he wrote a piece, a very fascinating story that he actually started writing a piece called the Mysterium, because he was actually very fascinated by the nature, by the outer space, by the mysteries of the human spirit. And he actually started writing a piece called Mysterium. That he said that he's going to change the world with his piece. So he started writing and said he wanted to premiere at the Himalayas. So he wanted to premiere there. But what happened was he started writing and he died. He died. So we only have, let's say, 1/6 of that piece. So he didn't get to complete it. So he didn't have a very long life, because I think he died of illness in his 50s or 60s. I have to look up his dates. But he didn't have a very long life. So we'll never know if he lived after the revolution, what would have happened. Would he immigrate to the West? Would he came to this country like Rachmaninoff did? That we would never have known. But what is true is, after the revolution, his music, his ideologies started to get less popular with the political environment of what's happening after the 1917 revolution. But throughout the middle part of the 20th century, people started to get fascinated by him. So I hope you enjoy this. It's the Fantasie in B minor, Opus 28. Thank you. So I think that's what he meant. You know, he wanted to he wanted to pure the human spirit, like it's like a purification. Like he was very open-minded person, and he was Jewish, so he was actually, even though the anti-Semitic movement was back then very evident, but he wanted to open up more ideas to incorporate everything. So he sees music as a purification, I would say, for the human body. So I think, I mean, I don't know if you felt that way, but I mean, that's how I look at it. Yeah. Thank you. So welcome back to the second half. I'll begin the second half with the music by Samuel Barber. As some of you might know that, probably most of you will know or knows that he is one of America's most iconic composers. Actually, during the first first couple decades of the 20th century, I think people in America were trying to find out their musical identity, because from the 19th century to the 20th century, there has been a shift of musical tastes, of compositional tastes. And Barber, even though he was actually not specially known to be a jazz composer, Barber, because if you associate American jazz, you would probably first associate with somebody like George Gershwin. But Barber was American, and he definitely was aware of blues and jazz, but it was during a time that actually people were searching for that American identity. So what makes it sound American without being too much jazz? You know, so that I think is what Barber has made a landmark in his music, because you can instantly tell, if somebody from Europe or from Asia, they could instantly tell, oh, that's American, that's the sound of America. So, which is a very distinctive voice that he has cultivated over his compositional career. There's actually a funny story. I was reading about this just recently, that when Barber was 7 or 8, when he was still a child, he was already starting to compose music, and he told his mom, because he was actually writing some music, and he was telling his mom that I'm going to be a composer, and I'm going to be world famous someday. So he already knew he was going to be a composer. He was determined to be a composer even as a child. So that's actually very something, you know, because he would dedicate. I actually know somebody who knew Barber. I don't know him personally because he died in the 70s, but I played for people who knew him. So he was a very, actually you can tell in his music that even though he was a modernist, he was in that modern era that very close to us, but he was actually in a way a bit romantic and sentimental sometimes. So he had that, he was always sometimes very drunk, and he wrote music with a lot of feeling, I think. So one of his famous compositions was the Adagio for strings. So there you have it. So the 4 Excursions by Samuel Barber. So hope you enjoy this. now we move on to the Canadian segment of this program, which I'm actually probably the first time that's going to be played in Placitas. Actually, I'm going to reverse the order because on the program it says I'll start with the François Morel Étude Sonorité, and then the André Mathieu Canadian Spring, but I'm going to reverse it because André Mathieu was actually from an earlier period, a more romantic period, and Morel was actually more recent because Morel died just a few years ago before the pandemic. So I'll say a little bit more about André Mathieu first because he's going to be played first. He was actually a child prodigy that he was a big sensation in Paris and in New York because most people don't know that he actually won the competition that's actually the 100th anniversary competition for young composers at the New York Philharmonic in the 1940s. So he actually was a winner of that competition. And he actually played some of his music at Carnegie Hall, and he was attended by a lot of the matured composers and pianists during that period. And they all said he was a fascinating child prodigy, that he wrote most of his works as a teenager. So, because he later in his life, he had a very depressed life. He was always, he had alcohol problems, and he died in his 30s, actually. He was only 39 when he died. So he was a Canadian composer, but very much influenced, because somebody during intermission was asking me about whether these Canadian composers, because these two composers were from the French part of Canada, so they were Quebecois. So were they influenced by the music from France, or there were any Debussy influences in this? Yes, I would say yes, and I would say that it's much more. So they were André Mathieu was very much influenced by music, actually all the good music, I would say, that's fashionable during the 20s and 30s, including Hollywood, including American music, because there is actually a work. He wrote a piano concerto. Part of that concerto is actually, the music of that concerto is actually used in a Hollywood film called Whispering City, black and white. If you actually are curious about this, you can actually look it up online, that there is this film called Whispering City that's actually filmed in Quebec City that uses his music in there. So he was actually, imagine you being a teenager and your music is already being used in a Hollywood film. So that's quite something. So this piece that I'm going to play is called Canadian Spring. It's actually by André Mathieu, which you will hear first. He wrote it when he was, I think, 13. So he was very young when he wrote this. And it's a very fascinating piece. And you can tell it's written by a teenager, but it shows that certain characters of being a teenager cannot be written by somebody in their 40s or 30s or later in life, because it sounds like a teenager wrote this, but in a very richly harmonic language. So I wouldn't be surprised that some of the older composers would say, wow, like he wrote this as a teenager. But it is true, because he did wrote most of his works as a mid-teen or late teen. So yeah, and actually I do know him personally because he died in 1969, I believe. So he was way before my time. But I'm actually in communication with his nephew. So actually his nephew was writing to me saying that he's looking forward to hear his uncle's music played and other parts of the world. So I'm glad to be able to bring this here. And also the second composer is François Morel. They're not very long. Both pieces are not very long because I don't want to. I want to be very selective. So the second piece is called Étude de Sonorité by François Morel, and he's actually a very major Canadian composer whose works has been premiered by major orchestras in Canada and the United States, and I personally think that, of course, I don't know him also because I don't think he was composing by the time I was touring as a pianist, but I do know people who knew him in Quebec. So this etude, actually, I was wondering what makes this etude, because etude is like a study for the piano, and I feel there's a very strong rhythmic sense in this his compositions, and also I feel that he explored a lot of fascinating harmonies that you sometimes think that you hear these harmonies in music by late 20th century French composers like I don't know, like Messiaen, something like that. So it's actually very fascinating harmonies and tones that he uses, and it's also very sensitive, I would say, sensitive harmonies. So also it's kind of like a bravura piece in a way. So it has a lot of biting qualities to it. So I hope you enjoy this selection of two Canadian composers. And yeah, thank you. to near our end of our program, it's some familiar music by Frédéric Chopin. This piece is called Andante, Spianato, and Grande Polonaise, which actually originally was written for the piano and the orchestra. Because during the I think Chopin wrote it when he was in his 20s, so that would have been in the 1830s. And back then, musicians used to, with orchestras, musicians used to hire other string players. So they were mostly pick-up orchestras during that time period in the 1940s. And the musician would be the manager to distribute fees for individual musicians, not the concert presenter, the other way around. So the musician would rent a hall and hire the musicians of the orchestra and pay them a sum of money for their concerts. But during the later part of the 19th century, this piece, Andante, Spianato, and the Grande Polonaise, is often performed by the pianist itself, like without the orchestra, because it has become a fashion towards the later part of the 19th century, because some of the pianists realized that it's actually the orchestra has a more supplementary role than the piano. So you could actually play the orchestra part within this piano part without the orchestra. So that has become a fashion towards the later part of the 19th century, and until now, actually. Because this piece is actually played often in various concerts, in competitions, and it's one of Chopin's most beloved pieces. Although it's not as famous as something like the heroic Polonaise or some of his other, the ballades. But this is a very useful work that's actually very brilliant, and also people during the turn of the century, like 19th to 20th century, every pianist played it, almost every pianist, I would say, because there was a group of Chopin enthusiastic, a group of pianists who were very enthusiastic about his music, that all played Chopin. They didn't play much else. They didn't play other composers much, except Chopin. Even Rachmaninoff, because Rachmaninoff was, I think, other than his own music, he played mostly Chopin, Beethoven, and some romantic music by Liszt and Schumann, right? So this piece is often played by the soloist alone, without the orchestra, and everybody during the turn of the century played it differently. So you have, I think there is an archival recording of Joseph Hoffmann playing it during his, I think, Golden Jubilee concert, when he was already very old. He was already like in his 70s, I believe. Or I'm not old in that sense, but I meant in terms of pianistic career, I would say. So, because Joseph Hoffmann was one of the first American because he became American because he actually was from Europe, to play a televised concert on the TV, right? So in the 1940s or 50s, so way before everybody else, he was one of the first. So it shows that this piece was one of the works that pianists loved to perform. So imagine we are in, I guess, the Paris salons of 1830s and 40s. Yeah. Okay.
Thank